There's no plug and play hires. You can't go and hire this person from the competitor and bring it in. So you have to find a biologist, a chemist, an engineer, in our case, a diaper person, and you bring them in and then you put them in the room and they all share their stuff.
Ignite your curiosity with Austin Next. I explore how ecosystems are built and how tech shapes the future. Austin is the frontier. It's where innovation takes root and new myths are made. Join what's next. Tero, welcome to Austin Next.
Well, thanks for having me on. I'm excited to chat.
All right, I'm going to start with like the really big question. Why mushrooms? I feel like across all your stuff, like that's mushrooms and fungi has been that kind of that thread.
Yeah. I say that they chose me, I didn't choose them. So my backstory is that I grew up on a family farm that we've had at least since 1619, and I learned about foraging, not just mushrooms, but berries and all kinds of other things since I was yay high. My mom taught physiology and anatomy. My dad was an agronomist. Our family has a long history with mushrooms. Finnish people have...
I'm sorry, what's an agronomist?
Agronomist is like professionally trained farmer, basically,
Okay.
So you're a fancy farmer.
Fancy farmer. Okay, got it.
So I learned a lot about natural living, and our family had a long history with mushrooms. My elementary school was an environmental school that my great-granddad helped to start.
Oh, wow.
And then I studied chemistry and nutrition, and by random chain of events, about 20 years ago, I discovered a mushroom, won an innovation award with my friend, and that kind of pulled me more into that world. I tried to leave that world, and then through sports nutrition, which was my big passion at that time, still is to a certain point, was like everywhere I looked was like mushrooms for physical performance came up, and these adaptogens, and that pulled me in. Then I started a company called Four Sigmatic a little over a decade ago. We created the original mushroom coffee. Now I'm writing mushroom books, touring around the world, talking about mushrooms. And then then I met cool mushroom people, and now I learned about psychedelics, and I learned about mushrooms for environmental biotechnology use cases. So it was kind of a thing where I feel like they energetically pulled me in versus me choosing them consciously.
Yeah, and so I've heard about like mycelium as a new material in like synthetic biology. Almost getting down at the core level, why do you think mushrooms has this cornucopia of different use cases in, as you said, everything from nutrition to wellness to, I want to get into the HIRO and then the same, and then now also as like a literal material to build from.
Yeah. So first of all, I firmly believe that there's a lot of answers in nature we haven't discovered yet, particularly in like the ocean and other things. So a lot of advancements in, be it the biology or chemistry side of, for example, biotechnology or material sciences, a lot of that can be drawn from nature. And what happens to be that in this biology, for example, there's few of these kingdoms. Fungi is one of the kingdoms. They're not plants, they're not animals, they're not bacteria. But they are a crucial core of the whole planet, and including us. And what I mean with that is that if the planet is, call it 4.5 billion years old or so, fungi have been around for at least 2.4 billion years, and they were the first thing to come out of the ocean to the dry land. They help create essentially our soil and the environment for plants and other things. And along the way, in order to do that, they became these extremophiles, or they already were extremophiles, and then they used it. And what that means is that they can adapt to all kinds of very unique circumstances. Like you can find them in every level of our atmosphere. Fungal spores are in the air. There's all these mind-blowing facts of them growing in mere space station, even though we thought nothing can grow in space.
Right.
So this is all just lengthy to say that they're everywhere. They're literally in the air. Our skin, our gut has fungi. And we humans, specifically, we share up to 50% of our DNA with fungi. So we're very prone to fungal diseases, but we're also very adaptable to quote-unquote fungal medicine. And in the case of like environmental reasons, they've been doing the environmental cleanup for, billion plus years. So it's nothing new to them. They're just adapting to new materials like plastics that we've kind of birthed in a way.
And is there a reason that you feel that I feel like I've seen mushrooms in general, like in wellness and obviously in food for a long time.
Yep.
But the adoption, is it we're really early in the cycle of using it for other uses, or is it that there's actually been, whether it be regulatory or cultural like reasons, it hasn't spread as well into kind of other realms?
Great question. We're very early. So obviously for culinary reasons and even medicinal reasons, there's at least 2,000 years of documented use. That's not so novel. But the use case for, let's take pharmaceuticals, it's said that roughly half of the best-selling drugs utilize fungi, and about 40% of all drugs use fungi one way. And in a way, a lot of that started with penicillin. That was discovered by accident because fungi, as the kingdom, contains mushrooms, yes, but also these molds and other forms of fungi. And that was like discovered by accident. And then because of this DNA similarity, in my opinion, then the pharmaceutical industries had a lot of breakthrough discoveries to fungal research. And that's fairly new. Like we're talking, 50 years, if that, And in the case of environmental reasons, particularly plastics, that was discovered, or it's credited to be discovered by these Yale undergrad students finding plastic-eating fungi in the Amazon about 15 years ago. So it's, from a science perspective, pretty brand new. So medicinal and culinary use, ancient, known. These alternative uses, like definitely emerging, early days. It's like 1999 in internet or something like that.
Oh, so okay, we got it. So we're not sure 99 internet is best because that means that means the crash is coming.
I did that very specifically for that reason, actually.
So then, do you see that we're too much on the hype train right now? Then
I do think that not so much on the material science and environmental aspects, but I think mushrooms are everywhere now, and I guess I'm partially to blame. But it's I think the quality of business operators have 10x. The quality of maybe product people has decreased, and I'm curious to see how it all plays out. But at the same time, I think in this current moment, some of the the Googles of the world are being built, and they might just reap the benefits in 5 to 10 years, if that makes sense.
On like the material science side, like I feel like I've been hearing again about mycelium as a, whether it be construction material or even some of these others, but to your point on the early side, I hear about it like at like Symbiobeta, I hear about it at like in the news, and then I don't see, and again, not as close, maybe correct me if I'm wrong, I don't see much actually happening, like in that commercial space and them actually getting out there. Is it the technology issue? Is it the adoption? Like what's the gap that's going on?
Depends on the category.
Yeah.
So let's start with the one point that's very critical that you kind of referred earlier. There are cultural reasons why, particularly in Anglo-Saxon cultures, fungal development, fungal research has been lagging. And that, nobody knows for sure. Some credit, molds, bad kinds of fungi in England and people getting afraid of it. Some credit psychedelics and the church trying to ban anything fungal related. Nobody knows for sure. There's a few theories, but surely Anglo-Saxon culture, North America particularly, is kind of mushroom illiterate, and Americans are behind very heavily. Versus
even though for culinary though, it's been part of our diet forever.
Not much, actually, compared to compare to Asian, Slavic, Latin cultures. You see mushrooms much more than the U.S.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
And even American cultivation methods have been very much behind Europe and Asia, for example. So there's this cultural thing that limits certain funding, talent, excitement, which I think a lot of is now being solved with the kind of like excitement, hype, discoveries around this kind of pocket of things. On the material science, when we talk about like mushroom leather and things like that, I feel like they are cool, but cost prohibitive. Manufacturing, I don't know if it's the killer app, as the tech people call it, for this technology, versus medicine and environment and things that are, first of all, they're like $1 trillion problems to be solved. So even if you solve a corner of it, that's amazing. But same time, from a scale point of view and kind of manufacturing point of view, some of these fungal inventions seem a little suspect to me.
I also think that it feels like a lot of it's the fungal, it's the material first rather than the product first. I mean, there was always who killed the EV1 and all that kind of stuff. Like, it was a bad car versus like when you see what happened with like Tesla, is like it was a cool car that happened to be electric. Like that was I mean, I'm oversimplifying it, but I think that was the start.
I talk with my business partner on my new company, HIRO, and new means we've been doing 4.5 years of R&D, and it's now out. But like we talk a lot about that, is like, especially environmental and sustainability things, which in a way Tesla also played on.
Yeah.
It only works if it's a dope product. Otherwise, for the core use case, be it transportation or in our case initially diapers, like people care about the environment, but sadly not enough, unless everything else is amazing too.
Right.
And then it's like a Trojan horse. So I completely agree is that sometimes, and this is classic, I think, innovator's dilemma, where there's this balance of product people or scientists, and then there's the marketers or business people, commercialization folks, and there's this delicate dance where both voices are needed. And I find in a lot of biotech, not just fungal development and material sciences, the scientists and product people are also the founders because they have this domain expertise, but then they lean into their strength too much, and they put the cart before the horse, and they lead with not the consumer need or the problem, but they lead with this discovery that they made. There's also plenty of examples where it's lopsided, where there's no hard technology or innovation, and it's just marketing. But I do see, particularly in biotech, I'm blown away how many companies have no focus on the consumer or the problem is very fabricated, and instead they're focused on like the cool widget. And
so that's my background, is all in bio and health, and yeah, I think especially right now when you have the technological changes are so massive that when they're like, well, it's good enough. Like, well, no, the business, not even just marketing, but just the actual business understanding, business models, go to market, who the actual customer is, the financial structure. That's one of the reasons I think we have CRISPR-based cures that aren't going anywhere. And it's like, and you'd be like, conspiracy, or they want to keep you safe. No, what's the business model for cures? Back to your point on the innovator's dilemma, like the Pfizers, the Mercks, they understand very well how to do long-term chronic disease. Like, you have this, I'll give you the drug. We'll go back and forth. That to Clayton Christensen's entire point, like, to have a one-shot cure, it's literally Kodak. It's like, well, no, but our business model's film, and like this is how we do. We can't switch to digital cameras. It's like our business model generally is chronic diseases, and we know how to do this. Like, if I give you a one shot, it goes like, wait, how we market, how we fund, that doesn't fit at all, and so it requires a completely different merging of the technology and the business side. And then I think that for the regulatory side, I mean, I think one of the funniest things was I forget the name of the company, but it was a psychedelic. They got all the way to FDA, to phase 3. They went to the FDA. The FDA then rejected them because they said, well, you didn't have a proper control. I'm sorry. If someone is on a psychedelic trip for depression or PTSD,
it was
like you can't
MDMA for MAPS.
Yeah, thank you. Like, you can't not know. And so, like, the idea being like, well, it doesn't fit into the current structure. Like, well, okay, we need to rethinking. That's just what he's like, of our technologies, whether they be, biotech, mushroom, psychedelic, like, they don't fit into the current structures in the way that we're thinking about them.
Correct. And in that case, both can be true. Like, I know that case fairly well, and many other people involved, and in principle, I'm very supportive of it. I think there was also, and this is my opinion, people drank the Kool-Aid pretty hard and got like ahead of their skis, and I don't think their research was as solid as they should have done it, knowing that they're probably going to face, adverse commentary. So they should have made it bulletproof, and they kind of did it, in my opinion, the opposite. They left it pretty loose. that doesn't mean that, to your point, that like if you take MDMA, you probably know it's not a sugar pill. Like,
right.
You took, you know, unless the control is like a lot of caffeine or something, you know, I don't know what, you know. Yeah, you probably
Our placebos
know.
are going to really change now, you know.
Yeah, totally. But yeah, both can be true, and that's hard because when both parties know they have a nugget of truth, they're resistant to the other side too. You know, because like they know they're not completely in the wrong, so then, but it takes you to accept both sides and work through the current system paradigm to get it to market. Now, there are examples where people force that change by just being charismatic, amazing somehow, but I generally think that that is one of the main obstacles here. The good thing is that in the case of, let's say, fungal technology, but also biotech in general, there are these massive problems where, if you can just solve a corner of the puzzle,
right,
that will probably unlock the next round of funding or the deal that gets you to the next phase. So you don't have, nobody can deal with eat the whole cow with one bite. You kind of have to go in smaller chunks. So if the TAM is truly massive, then that solves a lot of the problems, I think, as long as you just stay focused.
So you mentioned the next deals. I think it got a good question for you. So, you know, my background is, again, just more in like tech and bio, so not as much in kind of the CPG space. So for something like, we'll start like Four Sigmatic, what's the kind of journey with, is it bootstrapped? Is it getting funding? Like how do you take it through that journey? And when you think about like HIRO, is that going the same way or is it very different?
Very different. And what I would say is if there's anybody listening who wants to start a CPG company or has one, is like, definitely don't do what I did, you know. It's like, but I think there's, so first and foremost, so Four Sigmatic mostly sells coffee. It's functional coffee with mushrooms, and these mushrooms are legal and they have various health benefits. And then HIRO is trying to be the global supplier of plastic-eating fungi for any consumer products. The first product is a branded diaper, but the same plastics in diaper, polyethylene, polypropylene, these are like in most, like 70+% of plastic products in the world. So what the key difference between the two companies, which also involves to the funding life cycle and kind of how you operate a business, is that CPG almost always is indefensible. You know, you don't have any true IP besides the brand name. So if you buy ketchup or you buy coffee, like we had a little bit of advantage because when I started Four Sigmatic, there was no mushroom category, there was no mushroom coffee. You're early, you know, you paid the price of having to educate and explain a lot, but like there's some advantages, but they're not really strong moats, you know. And there's, again, you own the brand name is the one kind of defensible thing versus in biotech, be it on the chemistry pharma side, be it on the biology side, there's like really strong moats from an IP point of view. And that kind of sets the business model very differently. Like how much R&D and product development you want to do up front. In CPG, you want to do, weirdly, very little. And you want to start small, test with the ponies, ride the stallions. You do muffins. You get them on the farmers markets. You sell muffins. You hear what people say. Check out what muffins get sold next week, who comes back, what's the flavors, work on the recipe, kind of like tinker, you know? But instead in biotech, in the case of HIRO too, is like you spend sometimes years and you have these, you know, you have to buy expensive equipment and there's no revenue in the first few years.
Sure.
So Four Sigmatic started bootstrapped, has raised very little money. For every dollar we raised, we've made like $40+ of net revenue over the years. And in the beginning, we had none. And it was mostly self-funded, pretty much always been profitable with a couple exception years. And HIRO, on the other hand, has raised millions in pre-revenue. And also the exit outcomes or the kind of like,
when you raise venture capital, you're expecting venture capital results.
Yeah, and you need, at least why we couldn't raise money even if I tried, and for Four Sigmatic is like, how big is a mushroom coffee market? Well, I started the first coffee product 10 years ago. Now it's a $2.6 billion market, but nobody would have guessed that. You know, it's like we're the number one coffee on like Amazon, Sprouts, Whole Foods, number one functional coffee in US retail, but nobody saw that coming versus like global plastic problem. Okay, that's potentially a 10, 20, 30x return. So that makes sense for venture or it's just so different. And it's different from a like capital needs point of view. It's different from revenue projections. Like I've come to now realize, and you would know this better than me, you hit 5 million of revenue for Series A in biotech, and you're like tier A operator because none of them have revenue.
Right.
They all have these, bioreactors and equipment, but nobody has revenue. And in CPG, it's like you probably today should be more like 30 to 50 million, to do a bigger.
So I happened to be talking to a CPG investor like yesterday, and he made an interesting comment. So from the other side, which is, as an investor, how do they know something's not a fad? And
Yes.
It's interesting from your perspective because you're like, you were one of the first, or if the first, and having to educate. So how do you kind of find that line where you're like, no, this is a sustainable, it's a new category, and not, just the next Macarena or whatever. Like I show my age there.
Whatever I told the investors I met with didn't work. So so don't take that. My answer then and my answer today is still the same. It's first principles. Mm-hmm. These fungi have been used for thousands of years across the world in multiple cultures. Each one of those cultures, they've been elevated to sacred food or medicine. And they are actually, from a whole food point of view, some of the most researched foods in the world. So if you do PubMed research, you'd be surprised how little research there is in blueberries and what various things that get sold. Mm-hmm. So they're incredibly well researched, long history of use, multiple cultures, various very important health benefits, and they're incredibly safe. So from a first principles point of view, there's no reason. They've been here 2.4 billion years, and we've been here 300,000 years.
Right.
So I'm pretty sure they'll be here long past when us humans are gone.
So it'll be the cockroaches and the mushrooms.
Yeah, something like that. So that was my answer. Clearly didn't work. So don't copy that. But it is a great point, and I think the answer in CPG is weirdly back to the material science point of view, where people fall in love with their discovery. In CPG, people fall in love with an ingredient. Like they go as an exchange student, go to Argentina and find some cultural food that's not here, and it's like jicama, or
right.
It's like yerba mate, and why isn't everyone drinking yerba mate? And yeah, it's like totally. But like, what made yerba mate big was, in my opinion, besides years of education, was that it was made into an energy drink, and then it was a better for you energy drink, and that was the application is more important, even more important in CPG. Because of that kind of fad and ingredient reason.
Do you think of, so you said that the mushroom coffee market's 2.6 billion. Do you think of that as is it a subset of the coffee market? Is it purely a substitute where we just replace that? Is it kind of the energy tea, like a more of a health drink, market? Was it substitutes or was it grown? Like, how do you think about it from the actual place of the industry?
It directly took market share from coffee. Mm-hmm. And I know this from operating the business, but also from multiple consumer research papers. Now, it varies by subsegment. So Gen Z, for example, they love instant coffee and a different use of like cold coffee, a lot more than like Gen X or millennials, for example, did. And so the use of the product is very different, and they might have not gone to coffee the same way as the previous generation. But across all kind of subsegments, it's what we see. It's like we would have not become the number one or number two ground coffee on Amazon unless we took share from the large coffee incumbents. Like you can't get there with just like a niche audience chipping away. Obviously, the product needs to taste good,
Right.
it needs to work, all that stuff. But like,
Back to our first thing. You start off with it's got to be good coffee and get the benefits, and the fact it happens to be mushroom coffee is secondary, at least in the conversation with the consumer.
Yeah, and the coffee market is pretty stable across all economic sectors. The use case in home, out of home, ground coffee, instant coffee, those vary a little bit, go up, down, medium roast, dark roast. But like fundamentally, it's been pretty stable market. Obviously now Asian cultures are driving a lot of growth globally, but like generally, it's a very stable thing. And mushrooms going from nothing to plus 2 billion is just taking 1 or 2% of the global coffee market share.
So then there's obviously lots of room to kind of keep going.
For sure. I mean, still like niche on a global perspective, for sure.
And do you see so at this point, I mean, are to your point about like it's the brand, there's not a lot of moat, is there a threshold, or have we hit the threshold where you see the big guys coming and saying like, okay, great, we're going to go, this is a space that we're going to go attack now? Yeah,
and it changes. So when I started the business, there was this like number, like you want it to be at 100 million going 150. And then during like COVID, there was a big wellness craze and company as small as 30 million, but like definitely at 50 to 70 million in annualized revenue, and people were in it. Now there's like brands, I think this is somewhat public information, but like brands like Olipop that are doing over 500 million that are still haven't been acquired by strategic. And, it's like, it's gone up market. It seems like a pendulum that swings back and forth based on trends, but yeah, there's definitely a point. I would say more than the revenue, given especially the growth of online, what I've seen is the success in food, drug, mass club channels. So your Costco's, Walmart, Targets, like if you gain that distribution, at that point, those folks are incredibly interested in the brand and or the category.
Well, I think it's interesting, like in Austin alone, we've had 4 exits this year. We had, Data.World, we had Ojo, and then we had Siete Foods and Poppy. So 2 of the 4 were, billion plus in the CPG. Do you see, I mean, does it feel, and it's funny, they both were Pepsi, but do you feel like there's a moment starting, now obviously I'm not paying attention outside of Austin CPG market, but like, is there a moment happening right now in terms of acquisitions, people trying to get into this, or it's happenstance that what happened in Austin?
Surely, so there's a separate topic of Austin, and then there's CPG, M&A. It's definitely more now than it was a year ago. It's still a lot less than it was 4 years ago, for example. And I think in the case of, let's say, Siete, it's been a fantastic company, fantastic products, plural, and business for a long time. And in a normal market, they would have probably transacted earlier, and there was just this 2-year window, more or less, when very few things happened. Very, very few.
Yeah.
And so I think that's just kind of coming back live, and it's accelerating. I don't think with the tariffs and other kind of macro reasons, I don't think it's back to the full momentum. As far as Austin has always obviously had in CPG and natural products, same way as in technology and even biotech. There's been a lot of interesting companies to come out of here. Sweet Leaf Tea, Deep Eddy Vodka, Waterloo, the list goes on. But there's more now. Like there always was.
Yeah. And
Whole Foods, obviously, maybe because of Whole Foods, maybe because of the liberal hippie nature.
That's my question: is why do you think Austin? To your point, is that because when I came here, I didn't quite have the sense of the CPG that was here, and then all of a sudden I realized, oh yeah, your point, like all these things, everything from the food side to Yeti to all of that. And one of the interesting things from a storytelling aspect, I know we were talking about before, of like why was Austin so much punching above its weight. I think there was so many of the CPG companies here, Austin's part of their identity. And so they literally were exporting Austin's identity across the country and across the globe. And you're like, oh yeah, I know Tito's in Austin. And so it was this kind of interesting effect, and then realizing just how big it is.
Yeah. I think like with any innovation, there's no single reason, because like a lot of innovation and startups come from this like polymath emergence of cultures and energies. And in the case of Austin, there's obviously the university. So there's a lot of young people. It's obviously been also on the liberal side, liberal values often coincide with natural living, not always, and it doesn't have to, by the way, but it has historically been the case. So over indexes, like liberal means buying organic food and farmers markets and Whole Foods and stuff like that. And then obviously having Whole Foods and is drawing things. It's also for cultural reasons, a cool place from a music point of view, from various other factors that can drive like sampling and product absorption. And then obviously Texans broadly love buying Texan. So like it's good to have a home market that like supports their own. And this is not just an Austin thing, it's like San Antonio, whatever too. But like if you're a Texas brand and then you put the Texas flag there and you're right with that, Texans love supporting their own. That gives you that like initial momentum, because that's the hardest, the 0 to 1 or whatever is so hard in CPG to get the ball rolling, and having the Texas support can mean a lot to many brands.
Oh yeah, I mean, my kids now who've grown up now here for the last 5 years, like they love HEB, they love Buc-ee's. The idea of coming from California, I mean, like, yeah, there's that grocery store that everybody loves. Like, well, it's just Vaughn's. It's like, Ralph's. Who would think that? And then, like, I'll never forget, like, the first time we drove to San Antonio, we passed by that Buc-ee. We were like, what is that? And of course, now, I hope we get out of there by only spending like $50 or more on not gas, on all the other stuff and the food and everything. So, I think that's both you said like the really supportive, home market probably helps a lot.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and now there's all these other tailwinds of Austin that I think help. There's increasingly better investors, which was definitely not what started it, to be clear. I don't think Austin CPG world blew up because of investors. It was just great operators who wanted to live here. Similar to like, think Boulder, Colorado. It was like a Goldilocks zone between like a city and country, So it was like a place where people wanted to live and raise their families while operating a CPG business. But now there is, besides Whole Foods and HEB proximity, there is all these other ecosystem reasons. So if you go to an event and you meet all these other successful entrepreneurs that start at the company in maybe LA or San Francisco, like Kettle and Fire was San Francisco, now it's Austin, or Bloom Nutrition was like LA, Venice, now Austin. So like a lot of those people then came here and are part of the ecosystem that then helps incubate other brands as either investors, advisors, or talent even. Do
you see, and I think HIRO is almost this kind of perfect transition, a lot of connection between like the tech ecosystem and the CPG? Are they kind of really two different worlds here in Austin, or do you see a lot of kind of overlap and connectivity between them?
Pretty separate. Like I'm in YPO, and in my group I have CPG people and tech people, and they know each other. It's not a big town, it's a million people, so it's not like they don't know, and then the tech people invest in the fund that does the CPG, but at core, they're pretty different worlds, I would say. And I think that's actually good. And I think that's what San Francisco got wrong, because just north of San Francisco, there's a big similar liberal hippie eco world, like Marin, Santa Rosa, all those places. And a lot of amazing early stage organic, better for you, natural brands came from there. And then you got in the kind of South Bay, more or less, you got more technology. And at one point they started merging, and tech people started investing in these food brands, but they invested it from a lens of technology, and because it is indefensible and you don't scale it to the moon the same way, and there's actual physical manufacturing that goes, most of those were big failures.
But then what do you see? Because right now we're in a hard tech physical manufacturing, like that's coming back in a lot of different ways, both from just generalized, we need to reindustrialize the U.S. and general, but then also the technologies, and even more so in Austin. I mean, you look at this as a technological hub, whether it be, with rockets, cars, 3D printed homes, all of these different things. Like, we make things in the physical world, robots. And so might it actually be, if we driving more connectivity, there might be some more interesting things that occur, because some of the problems and some of the issues you just spoke about that happen with CPG are the same kind of issues that you're seeing with more physical and hard tech. Absolutely.
I think you're spot on. Maybe to zoom out a little bit. I'm a firm believer that innovation and any kind of progress requires this collaboration between cross-functional teams. And it's actually, I've lived in and seen it. So the best university in Finland is this Aalto University. It's now named after this famous architect, Alvar Aalto. Technically, it's only been around for 10 years. It was a merger of our best engineering school, which was probably like a top 5 engineering school in Europe. A business school, a good one, maybe like top 25, but the best we had. And an art school, top European art school. And they merged. And if you go to this school, after they merged these 3 or 2 big universities and one smaller one, art school, if you do an undergrad, you have, as an engineer, you have to take business courses and art courses. If you're an art student, you have to study engineering and business. And business, you have to study arts and engineering. And even though it's minimal, obviously, as an undergrad, they force you to like collaborate with the people with totally different perspectives early on. And I'm a huge believer in that. And I think the problem is that some various hubs become echo chambers.
Yeah.
And they're good at like incremental innovation, but not good at disruptive innovation because they're so lost in the sauce themselves. What's cool about Austin at this very moment, and we'll see how long it stays that way, is that there is the medical world, you know, and the biotech world, there's the tech, there's even like the silicon tech, then there's the software tech, and there's like, now there's the AI part, you know, and some of the people, by the way, did all of them, you know, like Brett Hurd and others, they've done multiple parts of it. And then there's the CPG, and then there's the cultural element. Podcasting, for example, is huge here. Stand-up comedy is huge. And they weirdly like come together and in a cool new ways. And I think that's what's really exciting about Austin's future. And I think that's what like mainstream media does not understand. They just looked at the mass immigration in 2020, 21, or maybe 2, and now it's like, oh, it's no longer that. But like, it's actually a lot cooler thing is happening under the surface now. It might take 5-10 years to really like reap the benefits, and we'll see if it comes to life. But I see it day to day as like really random collaborations, which are really exciting.
Yeah, by the time this comes out, I think it'll be a little old, but what we're recording, like, you know, it was yesterday or 2 days ago when the Wall Street Journal had that stupid article that like, Austin Tech is over. And I'm like, so I spent like literally the day just smacking them around, going like, here's all the reasons on social, like, here's all the reasons you're wrong. And like literally then the next day, you know, Deal Room comes out with their, you know, their startup ecosystem and calls us 5th in the world. And then, you know, Startup Blink has us as 16th in the world, you know, probably somewhere in between. I could buy that as 10th. I think 5th is amazing. I'd love to believe it. I think that might be a little bit overreaching on where we are. But I think it's also then it's a frontier mindset that is what's, I think, drawing people in and that connectivity, because I'm hearing side from both. I feel like longtime Austinites were like, oh, well, I'm not connecting in to these people. I was like, okay, well, I didn't know any of them, and now I do. And like, it takes work. But at the same time, you have Silicon Valley or New York people who come in and be like, well, why am I not being invited to things? Why am I not, like, well, you moved to the frontier. Like, you have to actually work. You have to go out. It's not, you can just, your network didn't come with you and all the invites came with you as well.
Yeah. So I'm from Finland. I've lived in 10 countries. Here in the U.S., I've lived in New York, L.A., and Austin. So those are my reference points from living in a city. And what I can tell that in many ways, Austin's a lot easier to meet people. Partly because of distance. I feel like everything is 10, 15 minutes away, more or less.
Yeah.
So the barrier to go to a happy hour or a meetup or whatever is so low. And then I feel like a lot of people are really approachable here. That is not always the case, like in big cities where people have their guards up more. So I actually think it's, if you put in the work, but to your point, you have to put in the work, it's pretty easy to meet people in the city, I would say.
Yeah, I always feel like I get the words wrong, the name of Michael Dell's books, like Play Nice and Win, or something to that effect. But the point is, like, there's this collaborative just nature that people, you know, will introduce you. You know, I say, like, if someone says they're going to introduce you to so-and-so, 80% of the time they will. And like, it's a hit rate you actually don't get in LA or New York or any of those. But how do we like drive some of those? You wouldn't think of like CPG and like together, but as your point, like there's a lot to learn and connect with. Besides like the classic, oh, we're going to have a CPG tech meetup or something like that. I mean, how do you think we can drive better cross integration?
First of all, I think it's already happening, and it's happening in ways that are very organic. I think Austin, my experience, I have 3 young kids, but in general, observing, it's very family-centric.
Yeah.
And if you don't have kids, you'll have a dog. And like people go, be it the school, park, dog park, and those are places where you meet people and connect with people in real life, which is cool. I like that. So at least for us, like we meet so many people through kids and kids events, and then they're in real estate or they're in these other things that I would normally wouldn't interact with. The other one is like pickleball or disc golf or these other things that people do here. But there is like pickleball tournaments, and I've observed, and they're basically like quasi-business meetings and investor pitches now, because like there's all these people talking about what they do, and they come from different worlds, and then they connect you with someone, and that's what's happening. So I think it's happening very organically. I think the meetups are tough. They feel fabricated.
Yeah.
And they work if you're all in SaaS business, and it's like fairly smooth to kind of talk about it. And even then, I would say they don't work that well. So
I also think like these really large meetups are. I mean, this is just personal. It's only a very edge case on the kind of social extrovert dynamic that somebody's like really.
Yeah.
I have friends who are like that. They just thrive. You put them in a room of 100 people, and they'll know everybody by the end of it. But like that's such a small group versus everybody else. Like, oh hi, I randomly walked up. We're holding beer. Like, let's talk. Right. Like it's a very inorganic way to actually kind of get people together.
Yeah, it works when you're in that event and a friend introduces you to another friend at that event, but to a stranger, the probability of follow up on either side is pretty low. Versus that somebody makes the intro, or you go to the racetrack and there's a bunch of people there and you're waiting and you start chatting. And
yeah.
It feels a lot more organic, and I think the probability is higher. But my experience is it's already happening here, and it's happening in not business settings, but it's happening in just living life.
Which, it's a flip side, I think, of a critique, because the critique of Austin has been versus like the Bay is like, oh, we don't have as many super ambitious people, which I think is not true. I mean a lot of this, but it's like it's not as monoculture. But I don't mean that this like as negatively as it sounds. But it is, you're in SF for tech, so like whatever percentage of you're in tech. I want to do this in startups or at the large firms. And that's everything we're doing. It's all that versus, I mean, even the fact we're talking about like tech versus CPG is a perfect example. Like there's a lot of different pillars in Austin, well, from the highly ambitious that we're going to go change the world to there's people like living their normal life, but it's enough of a spread that like, okay, one, I think we're actually protected a bit from swings in any particular thing. And then also you can create like a middle-class life. I mean, one of the things with this kind of reindustrialization, you have 20,000 jobs at the Gigafactory when, when the Samsung plant opens, like these kind of manufacturing jobs provide a whole different level of, opportunity versus when you have SF or like New York, it's just this bifurcated. Either you're in these top industries and you're fine and doing it, or you're in the very low levels of the service industries and you're kind of scraping by.
Yeah, spot on. I would say, obviously it's changing and evolving, but simplistically, there are the top tier anything in New York or LA or like, think of the restaurants. Austin has amazing restaurants, and I would say that for its weight, it punches really well. But if I would have to say, like, what's the best 5 restaurants, 10 restaurants in LA versus the 10 here, New York, LA would be better. Even San Francisco would be better. But then you go to the number 10, 15, now you're like, whoa, now we're talking. And it's also, by the way, 15 times smaller or something like that. So I think it's somewhat similar with the companies, is that if you go and look at the absolute 0.01% winners, like they tend to be in places like SF and tech or New York for other industries. But, there is the the downside is also true. It's like I know a lot of people who flamed out pretty hard in those places, like professionally and personally. And I don't get that energy in Austin the same way.
Yeah, and I think we're now at a point, one of the things I think about is from like 2019 to 2025. One of the things I think that everyone misses, obviously, is that Austin it's a 30-year overnight success. I mean, some of the things were like, oh, well, it's become a tech hub in the last 5 years. No, that's not true. There was this company called Dell and, and Trilogy and a few other these things. But I do think one of the things that changed from like 19 to 25, I think we're in a different kind of wave now, was I used it to like the heavyweight class came to Austin. And what I mean by that specifically is before it's like, okay, I would come to Austin and just be, one person be absorbed by the ecosystem, right? The people who came during that wave, either personally or through their companies, could change, like, themselves change the nature of Austin. So we're talking about, like, with podcasting and, like, stand-up comedy, with when Rogan moved here and all of the things that he kind of pulled. And it was funny, I was doing a Perplexity search the other day, and I was like, what are the top, stand-up comedy cities in the country? And put Austin as 3. Behind LA and New York. It's like, okay, that's a pretty amazing kind of jump that I don't think 5-6 years ago it would have been put as number 3.
Yeah. Yeah, and living in all those 3 cities, it totally makes sense. Like, and that's changed. And obviously, a lot of people that were successful in other cities have moved here in the last few years. So now the Tier A people are here too. But, they created their wealth or success somewhere else maybe.
Right, but it's not a vacation retirement. Like, I'm like, come here and I'm done. A lot of these people come in, they're like, I'm still building, and I'm building in Austin.
Yes,
which I think creates this interesting effect. I think you have this openness culture and you have this connectivity. I think one of the difficulties has been is a level of meritocracy from the perspective of it feels like we have a lot more wantrepreneurs than other places. And I think there's 2 reasons for that. And it's not a knock. I don't think these are not frauds or anything. They're just like not understanding what true building is. I think the 2 reasons for that are one is the size and density. Like if you go to SF, you know somebody who's working at one of these rocket ships or one of that. So you're like, oh, well, that's what real building looks like. I'm understanding what they're doing. So you have enough like reference points for that. I think that's quickly changing because of the amount of like literal rocket ships we're beginning to have here. And then the second thing is, I think it might be the shadow side to this very helpful and open culture, because no one is going to say like, yeah, that's a dumb idea, and like that pure like just unfiltered, like I know you want to be doing it, but like it's not working. It's the same reason when I hear it when somebody says like, well, there's no money, there's no VC money out there. I'm like, no, there's VC money out there and it's being deployed. It may not be going to you. So like look in the mirror and ask, why is it? Like, is it not working, or do you just need to step up your game? And I think we need a little bit more, but I think that's beginning to have now because of the little more cutthroat nature of Silicon Valley, New York, and those kind of people moving here. But the ones who are really connecting in well, I think have both, right? They're open, they're helpful, they're pro Austin, and they also give you the unvarnished truth.
Yeah. That's an interesting insight. The other thing to kind of build off of that tangentially is I've sat in multiple meetings while living here now 5 years where people are saying is like Austinites are comparing themselves to New York, SF, LA, and I think that's a huge mistake. Like don't do that.
No.
And particularly the tech people always like, how do we make sure Austin doesn't become SF? But like I think even that question is missing the core. Is like, don't worry about those places. Like, sure, they're case studies of something, and they're great at something. You can learn from them. But, like, Austin became what it was by doing its own thing, and I think that is what she should keep doing as well.
Yeah, no, I think the really beginning, early days of the podcast, like the intro of the podcast was like, we're not the next Silicon Valley, we're the first Austin.
Yes.
And you have that kind of mindset, which is one of the reasons I hate the Silicon Hills, Silicon Beach. So anyone listening to the podcast knows I rail on this all the time.
Silicon Taco. Or silicon queso, or
okay, those are new. It's ridiculous, right? Because like you're, the trying to copy something. There's your point. There are lessons to be learned,
of course, always.
And there's and I know this is going to shock people. there was innovation and innovation ecosystems before Silicon Valley.
Yes.
You know, Detroit in the 50s was the pinnacle of innovation. You had Manchester in the Industrial Revolution, all the way back to Florence, you know, in the Renaissance, to just keep going. Egypt, like all like you have these pinnacles, and like so there are probably things that rhyme across all of these things, but at the same time there are unique there are unique first principles to this. I've had people say to me, you know, before, like on the podcast, like, oh yeah, so these New Yorkers came here and they were so transactional and deal. I was like, yeah, because that's New York, and that's like, how do you think Wall Street like came about? Like, you can draw a straight line from Dutch fur trading to Wall Street, and it wouldn't have come anywhere else because it was innate to the nature of that city. But to your point, like, if you try to then say, like, I'm going to take those, there are lessons we learned, but I'm like, well, we want to be just like New York or just like, you know, SF. What are we doing?
Yes, I agree. And I think that is a theme I've seen a lot of people come here and then compare. And I would personally encourage people to stay away from that and just go back to the first principles. And again, you can always learn from something, but like, build your own thing. In a way, those other places not failed, but you know, they had their own problems. So, you know, don't focus on it too much.
Right. Or if you do see, at least understand those, what the problems were and some of the kind of...
But they might be unique to your point about New Amsterdam or LA, gold mining, all that, like, you know, gold rush type of stuff. Like, they were unique things in time and place that are not going to come back again. And you cannot build a new LA and like... There's no point because it was built in a time and place where the world was, and now the world is totally different. And some of the foundations of those cities, same way as some of the foundations of Austin, are built on something totally different. So what's the point even?
Right, and understanding what those foundations are, because you have certain cities like New York and London. Well, of course, they all go through their, you know, problems and ups and downs, but there is a immortality, maybe not to that point, but the sense is like, you know, New York went down like at some point in the last few years. I'm like, yeah, but I have every confidence that New York will be, you know, come back, right?
I'm very bullish on actually New York, and yeah, it's a separate topic, but yeah, I think those people have a lot of grit, and if nothing else, that grit gets you pretty far.
So how do you think about back to this kind of connective use? I mean, you said you were in YPO, like I just did an episode with Entrepreneurs Organization and talk about those threads. What about like the companies themselves? I think HIRO is just like, and if you want to talk about it more, like, is an interesting bridge from a technology company, but also, you know, having CPG as kind of that first line. Yeah.
So what's the exact question? Is like how on the community side or on the business building side, or?
Well, I think it's both. I mean, one is you have to like bring in different understandings to have something that's like a technology platform, but then basing around CPG, and then it is this kind of convergence effect, right? Because you have to have those and how they themselves are then connective tissue. Yeah, so HIRO did not invent plastic-eating fungi. Nature did, and we didn't discover it. A bunch of researchers did, and it's studied in top universities, including here in UT. In town, there's a group that does something adjacent. But we were one of the first ones to commercialize it, and there's a lot of like using it for a specific use case and commercializing. There's a lot of problems that nobody solves. So this, again, to this frontier mindset, there's no plug and play hires. You can't go and hire this person from the competitor and bring it in. So you have to find a biologist, a chemist, an engineer, in our case, a diaper person, and you bring them in, and then you put them in the room, and they all share their stuff. You know, I think the electric cars is overused example, but probably somewhat similar. Like, you had to bring in car people because the doors, like car doors, are very simple but very specific. Right. You know, and they have to work. And you can kind of tell in the early Teslas, the doors, in my opinion, were not that great, and then they're better. But then you had to bring in tech people for the software piece, and then you brought in the battery, and then there's the manufacturing line, and the robots that they have is insane. So, like, you needed this collaboration, and HIRO is doing something similar in at this stage a much smaller scale, obviously. But we couldn't just hire a person. Like, we'd have to hire from each one of these domains and have them learn from each other and solve these problems. So
to me, that's cool, that's interesting, it's intellectually stimulating, but it is hard versus having a SaaS playbook and running that model. But I also think a lot of talented entrepreneurs keep doing these business models over and over again, and it's a disservice to the world because the actual innovation is hindered with that model.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I think business, we don't talk enough about, I think, business model innovation until after it like happens. Like, oh, well, they did this, like they invented SaaS, and then so much of the time it's like, well, we just put SaaS into this model. I'm like, well, it's a good model, but even right now, like the SaaS model's breaking down because of like AI. Like, it's a very different. Like, if I just have my answer, do I need to be based on outcomes? Like, it's completely changed. How do you think about like? We kind of talked a little bit about like manufacturing, and obviously we had large global supply chains, and obviously saw what happened with COVID, and it's very much in flux right now with like the tariffs and everything. So how are you thinking about like manufacturing at scale?
Yeah, so Four Sigmatic is very classic CPG company, asset light, use these contract manufacturing partners. We have like, I think 9, and they're different parts of the country, and they have the factory, they're all US based, but then, coffee only grows in Hawaii, so then we order it from Honduras or Colombia or whatever, and then it gets roasted here, and then it gets packaged and grinded and added and all that stuff, right? But it's not on our balance sheet, which means that we can scale demand up and down quite quickly, to a point, of course. But like for an emerging brand startup, plenty of capacity if you just know what you're doing. But then if you have a unique product, sometimes happens, like Kettle and Fire just launched their own factory because like they couldn't have the capacity, so they had to solve for that. But in general, CPG companies don't own their own manufacturing facilities, and they use these contract manufacturing. HIRO, on the other hand, has its not just its own laboratory north of UT, but their own manufacturing site in Bastrop, not too far from Austin. And it came to the point is like, yes, you could later down the road use manufacturing facilities, and that is the goal, that each continent you would have a partner who would manufacture these plastic-eating fungi. But because of R&D and because of the initial, product market fit, it was like close to impossible to do unless you build it yourself. The speed of innovation, but their capacity to build and service customers was just so much greater. So it was like almost forced to do that. And there's pros and cons to both. Now you're dealing with, labor and leases in a totally different way, and you have a CapEx investment. But if you do it right, you control the product, the quality, and the cost a lot more. So, I think it was, to your point, not that trendy or in vogue for a while, and now it is, or people are more interested in it again. That just means that you got to fund it. The problem is, or headwind that I think people have not answered, is when you fund CapEx and facilities, the risk and return are totally different than if you fund the IP and the technology, right? But it's usually the same people, VCs, funding that business model now. Now, I think that will force VCs to become more like private equity type players, and I think they already are. Not just in the later stage investment.
You mean raising $20 billion funds?
Well, that's already happened years ago. The big funds are already there later stage. They are basically private equity. They even do public markets, But I mean, more even early stage folks, if manufacturing were to come back, they would have to, I think, settle for lower returns or blended returns between this manufacturing and this technology merger. Probably that hopefully also risk adjusted. There's less risk because if it goes well, you still own something. You own a facility. You're not going to get the great return, but also the downside is smaller. So I haven't seen that yet to happen, and I think that's limiting some of the innovation on that manufacturing on startups and emerging companies. It doesn't prevent the big companies at all. But
it's interesting because we talked about going back to what you said originally, which is like in like Four Sigmatic, it's the brand, it's like that. Then you have a lot of IP. Then like here you have a lot of IP and the technology. What's also interesting, and I've heard others say this, is when you're then owning the manufacturer, like that becomes a moat in and of itself. And if you've seen, like obviously, like something like SpaceX or some of these companies that are obviously extraordinarily capital intensive, but are able to, utilize almost that manufacturing as part of the competitive advantage in and of itself, and actually be able to make some of these kind of returns, even though you would think just clean sheet of paper, you'd be like, well, no, it's gonna return less because the capex is so much higher.
Yeah, for sure, it's category and supply chain driven. Like in the case of HIRO or SpaceX, I don't think there was a sustainable solution to not build it yourself. In other categories, you do. And but yeah, again, I fully support it. I think actually doing stuff is so vital, and we got away from it was all bits and apps and gadgets and cheap goods from China type of stuff. And I think it's cool that America is building again and manufacturing again. But that being said, no matter how thin you slice it, the cucumber has two sides, and it's not the same model anymore. And I think also the investment community and the operator community need to acknowledge that, is that if you want to build factories, it usually costs twice as much and takes twice as long than what it is in the pitch deck. And I think those investors and operators need to understand that.
Yeah, no, I remember fully at least getting it from the perspective of like when Anduril announced Arsenal 1 in Ohio, and like, yeah, and it's $900 million to build. It's like, yeah, you see how much why I have to raise so much in some of these is it's not cheap to build something of that scale.
Yeah, and obviously, Google has proven with, I guess, servers and others that you can get a return on those CapEx investments quite well. But in many cases, like, again, the return is not as great, but it is risk adjusted. It's like when you start building these facilities and things, it's like, it's not going to be a zero at the end.
Right.
Like if the software gets disrupted, then it's a zero. But the return is probably also initially at least not quite as great as on pure software play.
Yeah, and I think there's also, we've talked about I've seen data where like the surveys, and give me some leeway on the numbers, it was like 70% of people want manufacturing to come back to the U.S. and like 20% was like, would say that I actually would work in a manufacturing. But I think there's also almost a storytelling element of manufacturing, like modern manufacturing does not look like the 1950s like image of like I'm going to stand there and hit a hammer every day. Like no, like it's technological, it's robotic, it's like likely what you're doing in there is working with the robots than necessarily you being the one, doing the repetitive motion every day. And I think that, I mean, if you've seen like I'm sure you have like some of the drone videos like going through either a gigafactory or I saw like ASML put out some really interesting like videos as well. So like this more like it's not our grandfather's manufacturing.
No, not at all. And also, if you're a patriot, I hate to say it, but after spending years in these facilities, they are often, the machines do come from China, and even the people operating it are immigrants of various forms. And, they're using materials to assemble or manufacture, not just with like Chinese machines, but from foreign ingredients and subcomponents. So like how American it is, I think for supply chain stability and for the country, it's very important. But I would also like, maybe if you should visit a few of these sites to better understand too, is like how American it is. And I think that also gets misunderstood when the consumer, if you ask like, do you want to buy American? It's like, yeah, I want to buy American. Yeah, it's like assembled here.
Right.
With everything else being foreign. And that's the only part of the supply chain they see is the final assembly. And to your point about robotics, the same way, the full supply chain is still pretty global.
Right. No, and there's an interesting point. I was actually listening on the drive here to Packy McCormick and Mike Solana in a podcast and talking about like, some of the issues like with the rare earth metals, right? We get like all of them from China, but like we have them here. We just
in the ocean, right?
I think in the ocean, I think there are places. There was some large. I want to say New Mexico, something recently.
Mexico makes sense.
But like we don't like. There's like okay, we found it. Can you actually like? Can we actually allow us to like dig and get?
Well,
and get
there's environmental protections on the digging, but I think there's also the processing with those metals is a big bottleneck. And I think there's one place in the U.S. that does that.
Well,
but it's like that's my whole point about the Chinese machine and immigrants working on the floor using foreign print materials. Is like when people talk about manufacturing, I would hope they would zoom out and think of the full value chain instead of just one step down. Now they've been thinking about the packaged good, and then they go to the packaging.
Yeah.
But like you should probably think the whole supply chain and understand where it comes from. And again, that probably requires some interdependency with other countries around the world just because of various reasons. It's hard to be fully self-sufficient. Pretty much nobody is.
No, of course not. But yeah, like the the conversation they were having was about like, charter cities, like especially in zones. We're like, well, let's actually allow, right? We have all these bottlenecks to your point, but some of it has been we always used to feel like it was the Empire State Building in 18 months, and then $2 billion and like 2 miles for the track in New York, right? And don't get me started on the California high-speed rail. If you can see steam coming out of my ears for that one. And so like how do we allow those developments to actually happen? So that you said like you'll never be a completely isolated supply chain to what you want to be. But there are pieces here that can be done if we allow it to be done.
Yeah, totally. And I think, not my world, but it's very political. I lived in Hong Kong, and I would go to China a lot. And my least favorite city, probably in the whole world, was Shanghai for a long time. I hated it. I was just like, this is so horrible. I'm a farm boy from Finland. This is like the peak horrible. And then I went there pre-COVID, mind you. I want to say like 2019, and it was blue skies, and the weather and the city looked nicer than city in Helsinki in Finland. And I was like, what happened? Like, this is not the Shanghai I've seen. And I was like, oh yeah, we just banned combust engines, and like everybody's on electric mopeds and stuff, and the skies are clear now, and it's beautiful. And that's an example, I think, of like, to be frank, kind of dictatorship, but like a decision was made.
I don't think kind of dictatorship. Yeah. Yes, dictatorship.
It was made.
Yeah.
But not just made, it was executed. And I think there's the gap for U.S. is decisions are made, not executed. Like high-speed rail was decided and funded, not executed for a bunch of reasons, right? But I think that's where some of these countries thrived, and why certain countries also thrived around the kind of wartime crises, and they just move a lot faster. There's a sense of urgency. Yeah.
I think, we have the decentralized, all people like doing interesting things, which is the advantage of the U.S. And then how do we either galvanize or allow, like I said, the bill, so much, you said the high-speed rail, like, it's so much of it was like political, like, oh, well, this is, we get federal dollars if we go from X to Y, and it just, and then all of these, like, not being able to just actually build.
Totally.
Yeah. So this has been a lot of fun. I always like to end on the same question. What's next, Austin?
What's next for Austin, or what is the next Austin?
Now, what's next from an Austin perspective? What's next, do you think?
I have a feeling that Austin will go through kind of a rebirth in a good way, and I think it will come down to a lot of like ego disillusion, and I think right now there's so much momentum and excitement and goodness here, and I think it has to kind of like go through that cycle for this ego death at some point to happen, because it's new to it. New Yorkers have gone through it many times. LA has gone through it many times. I don't think Austin has had an ego because it never could afford to have an ego. And I think now it will have one. And I think it's a good thing. It's like it will go through the point, get lost in the sauce, and then have humility and come back even stronger. So I think that's something that happens. And again, that's a positive thing. And it just hasn't gone through it versus London or New York that you mentioned and other these places. They've gone through that cycle many times. Yeah. It's part of the maturing process. Yes. Yeah. No, I love it. Really something to definitely think about. This has been great. Thank you so much for joining the show. Thanks for having me on. So what's next, Austin? We're glad you've joined us on this journey.
Please subscribe at your favorite podcast catcher, leave us a review, and let your colleagues know about us. This will help us grow the podcast and continue bringing you unique interviews and insights. Thanks again for listening, and see you soon.